There is a certain expectation that settles into the mind when you think of Mississippi, slow rivers cutting through clay-colored fields, porches where stories lengthen into the night, the low and steady thrum of history breathing through oak-lined lanes. You expect cotton, you expect the sound of cicadas, you expect the familiar map of towns with names passed down like family recipes. But if you stand at the edge of some of this state's oldest mounds and listen, not for the chatter of tourists or the hum of a nearby highway, but for the silence that predates our records, you begin to hear a different Mississippi, one traced by vanished hands, by engineered earthworks taller than houses, by artifacts that refuse to sit comfortably in the neat boxes archaeologists try to build for them. This is not the tidy, textbook past. This is a place where stone and soil keep secrets, where measurements and myths rub shoulders, where modern science has lit many lamps but cannot yet banish every shadow. We're going to walk those ridges together, and we will promise no tidy endings. Instead, we promise big revelations and more questions, because the evidence we have is as rich as it is stubbornly incomplete, and because the human story that lives beneath those mounds matters to you, to me, to all of us who keep asking how we got here. So, let's begin with a question that won't leave you. What does it mean that entire communities once raised landscapes into living monuments, and then, for reasons we do not fully understand, left them to stand like silent testimonies in a land that later historians would forget to explain? Picture the fog clinging to the fields at dawn, the Mississippi Sound moving like a slow thought, and ask yourself, who measured the world in embankments and buried their ideas where only the roots of time could find them? We will speak plainly, but also with a storyteller's eye. We will be rigorous enough to respect evidence, pottery shards, soil strata, trade beads, and poetic enough to hold in our hands the myths that people told to make sense of their own lives. Some of what follows will be rooted in radiocarbon dates and surveys. Some of it will be speculation shared in the spirit of imagination. Neither approach is meant to deceive. Both are meant to bring you closer to the uncanny, to help you feel the weight of these places and the questions they still ask. In a way, this is an invitation to move from the known into the edges where knowledge frays and to find there, not fear, but a kind of hope, the hope that some mysteries are stubborn because they are worth solving, and that the open-endedness itself is part of our inheritance. So walk with me. Hear the thud of earth against the soles of your boots, smell the damp of ancient loam, and keep your eyes open for traces. Slightly darker soil that might be a hearth, an out-of-place bead that hints at trade across long-distance rivers, a shallow depression that could once have been a burial. We will be fair to the science, and generous with the wonder. And when a simple explanation appears too small for the thing it attempts to hold, we will set it aside and look for broader patterns, for the cultural logic that might have birthed these monuments in the first place. This is Mississippi, but not the Mississippi you think you already know. It is older, stranger, and more full of questions. Ready? Let's step forward. Standing on the flattened summit of a mound that rises like a small fortress above the floodplain, you might read its silhouette and think, a base for ceremonies, an elevated plaza for leaders. But the single-sentence truth about Nanih Waiya is sharper. Nanih Waiya, a great earthen mound that anchors stories of origin and authority, holds a story that intersects myth, Choctaw memory, and an archaeological record that refuses to be simplified. Archaeologists looking at the layered soils of this place find evidence of repeated construction phases, charcoal lenses that hint at fires long extinguished, and osteological remains treated with care, sometimes deposited with tools or carved objects. Historical sources, early European accounts, missionary records, and later ethnographies, carry fragments of Choctaw stories that place Nanih Waiya at the heart of origin narratives, a place where people emerged and where clans claimed sacred geography. Radiocarbon dates proposed by different teams have often been debated, with some suggesting pre-contact construction phases that span several centuries and others favoring an older, more punctuated chronology. The precise timing matters because it reshapes how we see technological exchange, social complexity, and the rhythms of population movement in the lower Mississippi Valley. But here's where it gets tricky. The mound's cultural resonance cannot be reduced to a single dataset. There are accounts of the mound as a living memory, a place of gathering, of rituals of authority, of earthwork renewal, that sit beside the sterile measurements of lab reports. Some researchers propose that Nanih Waiya functioned as a regional ceremonial center controlling trade routes running along tributary rivers. Others suggest it marked a cosmological map, a point in a sacred landscape connecting stars, crops, and clan origin myths. Still others hypothesize a defensive logic, an elevated place to watch the floodplain and signal neighbors. The evidence supports bits of all these possibilities but resists settling into any one neat theory. There are also mythic embellishments, stories told in later centuries of spirits that protect the mound, of giant ancestors who once walked the valley and left their footprints in stone. Imagine walking the foggy trail at dawn, the ground still cool underfoot, hearing the distant call of a heron and feeling the soft outline of the mound grow from the earth like a sleeping thing waking. For all the shovel tests and drone surveys, we still do not know which of these interpretations best captures the lived reality of the people who raised this mound, and so we keep asking, and keep listening for the next layer of soil to speak. On the bank where the river curves like an arm around a bluff, there exists an earthen platform so expansive that early visitors compared it to an ancient city plan. Its terraces resemble streets, its ridges look like defensive walls. One-sentence teaser, Winterville. A complex of mounds and plazas that suggest a social center with rituals so precise they shape the landscape itself. The dates here are both generous and maddening, with pottery styles and stratigraphic relationships hinting at peak activity around the first millennium of the last millennium, yet with continuities that bleed into later eras. At Winterville, archaeologists have recorded elaborate ceramics, finely decorated shell-tempered pottery that indicates both craftsmanship and broad networks of exchange. Exotic materials like marine shell and copper appear in burial contexts, hinting at trade routes that reach far beyond the river itself. Large plaza spaces point to communal gatherings, perhaps seasonal ceremonies of planting and harvest, while the mounds appear to have been constructed in stages, each layer a labor of many hands. Now, let's be fair, labor does not equal hierarchy in a simple, modern sense. The building of mounds might have been communal investment in a shared worldview, a way of embodying cosmology through Earth. But competing theories persist. Some scholars read the scale and organization as evidence of centralized leadership, an elite class capable of mobilizing and sustaining labor over generations. Others see a more fluid society, where prestige was seasonal, and the mounds were the product of cyclical cooperation. Still, for all the evidence of trade and complex social behaviors, we encounter gaps. Why, at moments that the stratigraphy suggests, did monumental construction pause or stop? Was it disease, conflict, environmental movement, or shifting trade networks? Myth and sensation slip in here as well. Local stories sometimes speak of buried treasures, of bones of prodigious size found under collapsed terraces, of stones that hum at night. Picture yourself on that plaza at dusk, when the last of the light smooths the edges of the earthwork and a small wind lifts dead leaves like applause. Can you imagine communities standing there, drums echoing through the night, voices rising in unison as the sky thickens with stars? We still don't know the full story of why the monumental heart of that community rose as it did, or why its building traditions waned. Between rivers and pine stands there sits an anomalous alignment of stones and soil that some call a marker of old trade roads and others call a ritual axis that connected mound to mound. One-line teaser, the Lost Ridge, an engineered causeway and alignments that suggest ceremonial travel and astronomical observation, yet whose purpose remains contested. Historical context here is less about written records and more about landscape reading. LiDAR surveys in recent decades have revealed linear features that do not conform to natural drainage, raised causeways that link floodplain islands to upland mounds, and palisade-like embankments that could have directed water or foot traffic. Measurements matter. Some causeways extend for hundreds of meters and show engineered fill composed of clay layers, shell, and charcoal, indicating intentional construction and maintenance. Key discoveries include beads of non-local stone, hints of trade with peoples to the west and south, and occasional burials set deliberately beside causeways as if to sanctify the route. Theories split neatly into functional and ceremonial camps. The pragmatic view argues these causeways were engineered to maintain dry passage during seasonal flooding, a network of logistical roads that connected habitations and market centers. The ritual perspective sees processional routes designed for pilgrimage, where elites or priestly figures conducted seasonal rites under a map sky. Now, let's be fair, both could be true simultaneously. Human societies often encode the utilitarian with the sacred. Still, for all the LiDAR clarity and shovel trenches, the Lost Ridge confounds because its orientations sometimes align closely with solar events, solstices and equinoxes, yet other stretches seem arbitrarily curved, as if responding to a now-vanished topographical feature. Imagine you are walking that causeway at dawn, feeling the breath of morning as mist rises from the surrounding marsh, and you sense the bones of a long procession, people moving with purpose, carrying offerings, stopping at raised stations where stones hum with the passing of days. We still don't know whether this was a road of trade, a road of gods, or a road that carried both. In the hush of a low, wooded ridge there are graves that do not fit neat typologies. One-line teaser: the curved graves, burial clusters with unusual orientation and grave goods that suggest social complexities and long-distance connections beyond what simple settlement models allow. Archaeological context notes that some interments are accompanied by artifacts that trace to the Gulf Coast and even to the uplands to the north: copper pieces and greenstone beads, materials not locally sourced, appear beside bodies oriented in directions that vary from mound to mound. Measurements of burial depth and the stratigraphic sequence indicate that some graves were reopened and reused generations later, sometimes with disarticulated remains rearranged in ways that suggest ancestor veneration or ritualized disturbance. Key discoveries include not only exotic objects but also human remains showing isotopic signatures of diets inconsistent with local consumption patterns, hinting at mobility or exchange of people as well as goods. Competing theories range from ideas of pilgrimage burials, where individuals chose to be interred at a sacred place far from home, to evidence of mortuary feasting that bound distant groups together in long social networks. Mythic elements drift near these graves, whispered tales of giants buried under mounds, of bones so large they were mistaken for tree roots, of cursed artifacts that bring misfortune to those who disturb them. Picture yourself standing before one of these graves at twilight, letting the last light fall across a stone that once marked a life now folded into the earth. You can almost hear the murmur of distant voices discussing kinship, honor, and debt. We still don't know whether these burial practices represent a steady-state social norm or punctuated changes caused by demographic upheaval. There are also places where modern instruments find strange anomalies: concentrations of magnetized soil readings, areas where ground-penetrating radar returns odd reflections that do not match expected architecture. One-line teaser: the silent echoes, geophysical anomalies that hint at large buried structures or voids yet to be excavated, resisting tidy interpretation. Here, the science is raw and technical. Magnetometer surveys show anomalies the size of a football field. GPR slices suggest features that could be post holes, buried wooden structures, or simply peat-filled hollows. Excavations, where they have been attempted, reveal collapsed features, post molds filled with charcoal, pits lined with clay, or, occasionally, large stones arranged in ways that challenge the assumption that wood and earth were the only building materials used. Key data also includes pollen cores taken from nearby bogs suggesting abrupt vegetational change at specific layers, times when the surrounding landscape shifted from forest to more open grassland or vice versa. Theories abound. Some scholars argue these anomalies represent lost architecture, great timber halls, palisade enclosures, or even purpose-built performance spaces whose wooden superstructures have long since decayed. Others caution that geophysical anomalies can mislead. Root systems, differential soil compaction, and modern disturbances can masquerade as ancient features. Mythic whispers, of course, add color: tales of subterranean chambers filled with echoing drums, of bone-lined galleries carrying secret songs, of places where the earth hums in the moonlight. Picture yourself kneeling at the edge of one of these survey grids, watching technicians interpret grayscale waves that they call signatures, and imagine the hush that would fall if they pulled aside the sod and revealed a chamber whose walls still carried paint. Still, for all the instruments and cores, we still don't know what those echoes mean: architectural masterpieces or natural palimpsests? The data pushes both ways. Finally, there are the stories told by rivers themselves and by the islands that float like memory in their bends. One-line teaser: the river islands, low, reworked landforms strewn with artifacts that suggest seasonal encampments and transient sites connected to long-distance hunters, fishers, and traders. These islands, raised slightly above flood level and often composed of shell and midden, contain concentrated debris, fish bone assemblages that tell us about species exploited, projectile points that show changing technologies, and fragments of woven materials that speak silently of textile practices now lost to time. Measurements of seasonal flood regimes indicate that these islands could have been habitable for substantial parts of the year, supporting specialized economies built around river resources. Key discoveries include evidence of specialized fishing technologies and burn layers that hint at seasonal camps returning year after year. Theories vary. Were these islands part of a mobile strategy tuned to the rhythms of the river, or did they function as permanent outposts for groups with wide-ranging territories? Some propose that these camps were hubs of seasonal trade, places where inland and coastal groups met to exchange goods, stories, and genetic material. Others imagine these islands more as thresholds, liminal spaces where identity was negotiated and where people practiced rites of passage linked to the river's flow. And there are legends too, whispers of lost canoes that traveled long distances under starless skies, of travelers who buried their maps in shells so that only their descendants could find them. Picture yourself on one of these islands at dawn, watching the river peel mist from its surface, imagining the scent of smoked fish hanging in the air, the sound of nets drawn taut. You feel the presence of repeated human motion, of lives ordered around the water. We still do not know how these islands fit into wider territorial patterns, whether they were the backbone of long-distance networks or the shorelines of very local lives. Pulling back now, you see a pattern emerge that is at once an invitation and a restraint. Mississippi's ancient monuments and the sites that surround them do not surrender their stories easily. They offer measurements, artifacts, and stratigraphic records, but they also press upon us myths, later cultural memories, and oral histories that cannot be reduced to carbon dates. Each mound, causeway, grave cluster, geophysical anomaly, and river island is a point of contact between the measurable and the ineffable. We have learned much, that people engineered their world in profound ways, that trade networks extended farther than once believed, that social and ritual life could rival the complexity of the most ornate urban centers elsewhere on the continent. Yet for all our instruments, for all our careful excavation, certain questions refuse to be answered to everyone's satisfaction. Why did some monumental centers rise and fall in patterns that do not match simple resource depletion models? Why do certain burial customs appear with exotic grave goods that suggest long-distance kinship ties one moment and nearly vanish the next? Why are some constructions oriented with apparent precision towards solar events, while nearby features submit to no such order? The skeptic in us insists on parsimony, the wanderer in us listens for meaning. Now, let's be fair. Archaeology is as much about asking better questions as it is about finding final answers. Every trench, every core, every radiocarbon date pushes the conversation forward. But still, for all the evidence and for all the debate, several core mysteries persist, and they demand more than just shovel work. They demand imagination calibrated by evidence, respect for oral traditions, and an open ear for the landscape's quiet testimony. There is a stretch of delta that, on maps, looks like nothing more than a smudge of green and water, but locals know a place they sometimes call the stone circles, a dispersed constellation of low-ringed features and compact mounds that, when seen from the air, form patterns at once regular and inexplicable. The stone circles, low, circular embankments and faintly raised rings that hint at ritual enclosures and communal gatherings, whose full meaning slips like mist through our fingers. Archaeological context for these features is built from careful surface survey, trench exposures, and the patient work of flotation samples that yield tiny, luminous clues, charred nutshells, minuscule beads of fired clay, minute fragments of basketry impressions that only the closest light will reveal. Radiocarbon samples taken from hearths associated with several rings give us a range of dates often clustering between roughly AD 800 and AD 1250, a period when the lower Mississippi Valley hummed with change, Trade intensified, populations reorganized, and new ritual idioms appeared on the landscape. Measurements matter. The circles vary in diameter, some no more than 10 meters across, others pushing 20 or 30, and their spacing sometimes follows straight alignments that could be coincidental and could also be deliberate. Key discoveries in these enclosures include concentrations of worked bone, small caches of ground stone, and occasional rare ceramics decorated in styles usually associated with nearby but distinct cultural groups. Their presence suggests not only local innovation but also recurring visits by people from varied networks. Competing theories strain to account for the mixture of domestic detritus and what looks, at first glance, like overtly ceremonial structuring. One leading idea posits that the rings functioned as domestic ritual hybrids, seasonal camp circles where extended kin groups stage rites that mark life cycle transitions, combining mundane tasks with formalized ceremonies. Another reads them as performance spaces, arenas where leaders displayed authority, where storytelling and dispute resolution unfolded in choreography encoded by the ring's geometry. A third interpretation suggests that the circles were territorial markers, non-permanent, socially negotiable boundaries used during specific seasons to partition resources or regulate access to floodplain hunting grounds. Now, let's be fair. Communities seldom keep their sacred and practical lives in hermetic compartments. What looks like a boundary to us may have been a stage to them, and what we call refuse may have been offering. Still, for all the beads and bone tools, the presence of exotic items, a piece of marine shell worked into a pendant, a fragment of copper smelted far upstream, complicates any purely local explanation and hints at long-distance circuits that threaded through even small-scale ritual places. Mythic layers cling to these rings as well. Storytellers pass down claims of stones that bleed if moved, of midnight dances where drums pulse with the rhythm of an older world, of circle keepers who once marked the sky with smoke to call ancestors. Picture yourself stepping into one of those rings when the mosquitoes thicken like a living fog, your shoes sink slightly into loam compacted by past gatherings, and if you listen, you might imagine the echo of sandals, the whisper of wrapped cloth, voices lifted in a language no longer spoken. A reflective thought here is unavoidable. These small-scale enclosures remind us that the human need to mark, to gather, to create liminal places where the ordinary becomes investable, is as old as our bones. They suggest a social world where identity was both local and porous, where meeting points were as important as permanent monuments. And yet, for all the careful excavation and the intimate artifacts that speak of hands at work and hearts at ritual, we still don't know whether these circles were the heartbeat of small autonomous communities, the nodes of a larger ceremonial calendar, or something we have not yet imagined, hidden in the thin soil between the blades of our shovels. Out on a low floodplain that the river has rewritten a dozen times, there are traces of a settlement that refuses to be read as simply a village or only a seasonal camp, a place sometimes called the Sunken village, where post holes appear in clusters, where midden layers wink in profile, and where the river's choreography has both preserved and erased the human record. The Sunken village, an ephemeral multi-component site on an island that records repeated occupation, architecture built of wood and wattle, and the ghost of a community adapted to the river's moods. The archaeological evidence here is often underwater or in saturated peat, which complicates excavation but also brings unique preservation. Organic remains that usually rot away survive, from fragments of woven mat to half-preserved wooden paddles, giving us an intimate window into daily life. Dating these occupations shows episodic intensity, bursts of intensive use, perhaps linked to fish runs or particular climatic conditions, punctuated by intervals of abandonment when flood regimes shifted or disease likely ran its course. Measurements of house footprint sizes, post hole diameters, and hearth distributions suggest a settlement with domestic units clustered around central activity areas. Certain houses show evidence of specialized tasks, such as dedicated spaces for tanning or food processing. Key discoveries include finely made net weights, diverse fish bone assemblages dominated by catfish and gar, and working floors rich with microdebitage from tool production. But the Sunken village also bears traces of participation in widespread exchange networks, exotic lithics and pieces of pottery with tempering techniques that echo distant workshops. Interpretive debates split over mobility and permanence. One camp argues for a largely mobile, river-tuned life world, groups moving seasonally, making temporary adjustments to flood cycles, concentrating population in high-yield years and dispersing when the river's pulse turned inhospitable. Another maintains that these are the remains of semi-permanent hamlets, communities resilient enough to endure flooding through architectural adaptations, like raised platforms and woven barriers. A third line of thought views the island sites as nodes in a seasonal circuit, central places to which multiple kin groups converged annually for feasting, trade, and ceremony, departing afterward to disperse across their home territories. Here's where the myth enters. Fishermen's legends of canoes carved from single trees that could cross open water at night guided by stars, of human-shaped stones standing sentinel when the river rose, of an elder who could call fish to the nets. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a submerged floor, water lapping at the remains of a post that still bears carbon stains. You can almost see smoke drifting from a small hearth, smell the cured fish, hear the scrape of paddle against oar. The reflective insight is painful and generous both. Life on the river was inventive and precarious, structured by knowledge of weather and water as much as by kinship. And yet, for all the preserved artifacts and the ecological reconstructions, we still don't know the precise social arrangements that guided resilience, who decided when to stay and when to move, how conflicts between groups were resolved when resources grew thin, and whether climate change or social shifts ultimately reshaped these lives in ways the material record only hints at. We still don't know, and that continuing not knowing takes us to a place even more structurally puzzling, a set of earthen mounds that, when measured and mapped, do not conform to simple concentric plans or to obvious ceremonial axes, but instead create irregular geometries that imply sophisticated local choices, purposeful but not easily categorized. The irregular mounds, non-standardized earthworks that challenge assumptions about uniform mound-building traditions, hinting at regional creativity and adaptive ritual architectures. Excavations at several of these mounds show building episodes that layer in complex sequences, a domestic floor capped by a thin construction layer, then a small plaza, then another habitation surface, a palimpsest of uses that suggests not a singular monument but evolving usage across generations. Radiocarbon samples are equally teasing, short bursts of construction clustered over a few decades in some cases, and slow accretion over centuries in others. Among the key finds are carved wooden artifacts, preserved only in waterlogged contexts, showing iconography that does not map neatly onto known art styles, small caches of groundstone tools placed deliberately in foundation cuts, and occasional human burials placed with a degree of care that implies remembrance without rigid hierarchy. Competing interpretations reflect this ambiguity. Some archaeologists propose that irregular mounds emerged from localized ritual innovation, small groups improvising ceremonial architecture to meet changing social needs, perhaps as a response to shifting alliances or resource patterns. Others read the mounds as evidence of factionalized communities where multiple groups shared a landscape but expressed identity through distinct building idioms. A provocative theory speculates that these mounds represent experiments in social engineering, local leaders or ritual specialists testing new forms of public space to attract followers or to manage seasonal congregations. Mythic elements here are fierce. Elders tell of mounds that rearrange themselves when no one is looking, of bones that rearrange into watchful shapes, of stones that issue soft thuds like a distant heart. Picture yourself tracing the edge of one of these irregular works as dusk amplifies the contours. You sense that the builders had a conversation with the land that was intimate and improvisational, a human response to a living floodplain. Our small reflective thought here is a kind of humility. Architectural nonconformity in the archaeological record suggests that diversity of social form is probably the rule rather than the exception. And still, for all the meticulous measurements and the care with which we reconstruct sequences of building, we still don't know why some communities pursued radical architectural variation while neighboring groups upheld strict uniformity. Whether innovation was driven by ideology, necessity, personality, or accident remains an open question. We still don't know, and that sentence sits like a stone on the tongue. But it does not mean we are aimless. Instead, it signals pathways for more attentive questions, new fieldwork calibrated to local voices, and a scientific humility that recognizes the limits of our instruments. Now, imagine the sun leaning low and spilling gold on the low mound ridges. Imagine the long arc of the river reflecting a sky full of late clouds. Imagine people, long gone, whose lives moved on rhythms we partly recover through potsherds and pollen. Those imaginations are not flights of fancifulism but responsible empathy with the past, a posture that reads material remains with respect for the cultural logics that created them. As we continue, let us hold tightly to the evidence while leaving room for the myths that live with that evidence, for both together produce a fuller truth than either could alone. There are tales that refuse to be pinned down, stories that travel along farm fences and river bends and gather shape as they move. One of the most persistent whispers speaks of remains so large they defy ordinary human scale, skeletons that, when first mentioned in 19th century gossip and later in oral retellings, were described as the bones of giants. The giant bones, reports and rare excavations that touch the edge of something sensational, where folklore and sporadic osteological findings collide and leave us asking whether myth ever has a mineral core. When we sift the archival record, what we find is an awkward collage. 19th century antiquarians who recorded oversized femurs without precise provenience, farmers who reported finding huge skeletons while plowing, and later, more careful osteologists who sometimes re-examined those finds and offered more prosaic explanations, that soil chemistry can distort bone, that selective memory amplifies size, that a fragmentary pelvis suggests largeness where none existed. Yet the pattern is real. Clusters of reports emanate from certain floodplain counties, and occasionally, intact burials with unusually large grave goods have been recorded with more reliable context. Measurements matter here, but they are often missing. Where bones were collected in the 19th century, precise length metrics are rarely preserved, and many specimens were lost to the trades of curiosity that sent bones to private collections. Modern analysis that has been possible, isotopic tests, morphological assessment, taphonomic study, usually returns to familiar territory, normal human variation, pathological conditions that enlarge bone, or simple misidentification. But here's where it gets tricky. The persistence of these tales tells us something about social memory, and about the way landscape invites myth. People who live among towering trees and sprawling riverbanks are prone to find giants in the pressure of the land because bodies and boundaries expand in oral imagination to hold weighty ideas: ancestors, heroes, ancestral enemies. Competing theories therefore split between literal and symbolic interpretations. One approach insists on literalism. Perhaps some individuals were unusually tall due to genetic variation or disease and were richly interred with goods that amplified their perceived stature, thereby seeding legend. Another approach reads the giants as cultural metaphors, stories of enormous ancestors used to legitimate land claims, to explain megalithic features, or to embody the awe of a landscape that imposes itself on human life. Now, let's be fair, archaeology has an obligation to test material claims rigorously, and modern osteology does so, but it must also consider the power of narrative. Imagine standing in a low, wooded hollow where local memory says a giant's burial once lay. The roots of oaks twist above a shallow depression, and as dusk gathers you feel the story like a pressure in the air, a community's way of sensing an older world. The reflective insight here is clear. Whether skeletons were literally large or simply remembered as such, the mythology of giants is part of how people translated the landscape into lineage and power. We still don't know whether those specific skeletal reports mark unusual biological individuals, ritual exaggeration, or the misreading of fragmentary remains, and in that productive uncertainty, the story keeps turning. There are stones placed in fields and along ridgelines that locals treat as if they were living things. Stones with names, stones with taboos, stones that bear cup marks and grooves whose meaning has been debated by antiquarians and archaeologists alike. The cursed stones, engraved rocks and megalithic remnants that give off a sense of intentionality and ceremony, and that draw both careful measurement and the sharp edge of legend. Survey teams catalog these stones by shape, orientation, and lithology. Some are sandstone boulders transported short distances, others are local limestone marked by weathering patterns that can be mistaken for human working. Careful measurement of cup marks and grooves, Microscopic analysis of percussion and abrasion sometimes demonstrates human agency, tools striking rock in repeated patterns. Radiometric analysis cannot date the grooves directly, but contextual finds nearby, charcoal lenses, flake stone, pottery sherds, occasionally bracket activity to pre-contact centuries. Here, the academic debate is alive and full of contradictory energy. Some researchers read these stones as territorial markers, durable signposts placed to delineate clan space or to memorialize treaties. Others interpret the cup marks and grooves as components of ritual practice, libation stones, mapping devices for star knowledge, or even mnemonic devices that encoded genealogies and seasonal calendars. Then there is the folklore, thick and thorny, stories of curses that befall those who move these stones, of harvests failing when a stone is disturbed, of nights when the stones hum like a distant choir. Farmers tell of plow blades that snag on buried stone and of livestock that refuse to graze near certain boulders, and such accounts have real social consequences for how the stones are treated and preserved. Imagine yourself kneeling beside a cup-marked rock, feeling its cold surface, tracing with a fingertip the subtle concavity worn into it by generations. It is easy to see why people invest such stones with agency, because the marks speak to repetition and attention, to hands returning to the same place for reasons that exceed the daily. A thoughtful observation here: material traces and myth together generate protective behaviors that have arguably preserved many sites from destruction. And yet, for all the microscopic polish and the careful ethnographic interviews, we still don't know the stone's original function with any universal certainty, whether they were practical markers, sacramental objects, or something that braided those two categories together in ways that no simple label can contain. Then there are the stories of strange voyagers, accounts, both archaeological and oral, that suggest people crossed remarkable distances and brought with them ideas, materials, and techniques that ripple across the map. The ancient voyagers, evidence of long-distance movement, whether by canoe, foot, or craft of other sorts, that complicates neat models of local insularity. We have tangible proof in the form of non-local lithics, chert sourced from distant uplands, marine shell from the Gulf, and in stylistic echoes in pottery and ornamentation that suggest conversation across pockets of the continent. Measurements of isotopic signatures in human teeth sometimes reveal childhoods spent in different geographies from where individuals were buried, implying migration or childhood movement across long distances. Key archaeological finds include trade beads and copper items that had to have come via networks spanning hundreds of kilometers, combined with paleo-environmental reconstructions that chart shifting river courses and coastal ecologies. These finds point to dynamic mobility. Competing explanations again band into two camps. One reads these patterns as the product of established trade networks operating on predictable seasonal circuits. People met on river islands or mound plazas to exchange fish, furs, salt, and stories. Another sees episodic movements, migrations triggered by drought, conflict, or opportunity, where groups moved en masse and reconstituted themselves in new places. Myths amplify the allure. Tales of ocean-going canoes that reached shores far to the south, of families who carried the knowledge of distant stars, of navigators who could read currents like language. Picture yourself in a dugout canoe at twilight, paddling through a channel that smells of brackish water and hot sand, guided by a person whose knuckles know the rhythm of waves. You sense the courage it took to journey, the social trust required to leave hearths behind. A modest reflection here: acknowledging long-distance movement complicates any model that assumes static territories. It emphasizes instead a human world of possibility, exchange, and risk. Still, for all the shell ornaments and isotopic signatures, we still don't know the full scale and cadence of those movements, how frequent they were, how people decided to travel, and what social institutions supported such mobility. Across these segments, giant bones, cursed stones, ancient voyagers, circles, sunken villages, irregular mounds, and silent echoes, a picture appears that is not unified but coherently fractal. Each site and each story gives us a glimpse of a society that was sophisticated in local innovations and bold in its reach, human in its contradictions, and resilient in the face of river and time. We still don't know the definitive answers to many crucial questions, and that persistent ambiguity is not a failure but a productive state that keeps scholarship honest and storytelling alive. Imagine once more standing at the river's edge as a storm rolls over the water, hearing thunder that sounds like drums, gazing at the land that holds the traces of thousands of lives. This is the emotional center of the work, a sense of continuity and of rupture, of belonging and of loss. Each artifact, each soil slice, each oral memory is a small lamp held against the dark. If you close your eyes and let the details blend, you start to see broader themes, ritual landscapes that knit communities together across time, trade networks that wove material and genetic threads across the continent, architecture that both expressed authority and embodied communal imagination, myths that encoded social memory, land claims, and moral instruction. The unresolved questions serve as an invitation to archaeologists to dig with a blend of humility and curiosity, to local communities to tell and retell their stories, to each of us to consider how we inherit places we did not build. Keep in mind that the science is iterative, surveys get better, radiocarbon calibration improves, DNA analysis becomes more refined, and with each technological advance we push back a little further into the fog. Yet even the best instruments cannot replace the human capacity to imagine, to tell stories that make sense of the ground beneath our feet. So keep digging, in the literal and metaphorical senses, because some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. There is a place where the land remembers water the way memory remembers a face. Peat beds and buried stumps hold the chronology of inundation and retreat, and when you pull a core from those black columns you read centuries like tree rings, wet decades and dry ones, each layer a small testimony to environmental pressure and human response. In those cores, scientists have discovered abrupt changes in pollen spectra that mark shifts from forest to marsh back to forest again, and alongside those changes lie human traces, spikes in charcoal that suggest burning, clusters of seeds that speak to cultivated plants, and tiny fragments of pottery that whisper of people shaping their lives around the shifting pulse of the river. These buried forests and drowned gardens force a question: when earth and water rearrange a life world, how do human strategies adapt? By moving, by innovating architecture, by negotiating new trade routes, or by changing ritual calendars until meaning itself bends to fit new shorelines. One theory holds that communities responded mainly through mobility. They moved camp nuclei, repositioned gardens, and remade alliances with neighbors to secure seasonal resources. Another argues for technological and architectural ingenuity, raised platforms, lattice drainage, and the social labor to maintain them across generations. Still others emphasize cultural adaptation, the reworking of myths and ceremonies to account for new cycles of flood and drought. But here's where it gets tricky. The archaeological record often keeps only faint signatures of these responses, and social nuances fade like footpaths under new growth. Imagine standing on a low rise at dusk, watching the revering light silver the floodplain, thinking of ancestors who read the current like a daily horoscope. Imagine them deciding, around a fire, whether to move a communal storehouse or to cut a new causeway through reed. The reflective insight is sharp. Climate and landscape are not mere backdrops. They are active participants in social history, shaping choices, identities, and the architecture of ritual. We still don't know the exact mix of mobility and innovation across time, nor do we fully understand who made those decisions: elders, councils, ritual specialists, or pragmatic household leaders, and that gap leaves space for both archaeological inquiry and imaginative empathy. Sometimes the evidence points toward abrupt ruptures rather than slow shifts. There are sites where a flourishing plaza seems to be abruptly abandoned and later reoccupied under very different conditions, and the abruptness suggests episodes that archaeology can sometimes map to specific causes: epidemic disease brought on by new pathogens, food stress following a poor growing season, or social conflict that made a place unsafe. In one low valley, the stratigraphy shows a thick layer of domestic refuse suddenly cut off by a sterile lens of windblown silt, above which a sparse scatter of later artifacts appears decades later. Theories split. Maybe a momentary catastrophic flood destroyed habitations and scattered survivors. Maybe conflict drove people away and left the place desolate. Or perhaps an epidemic reduced population and social complexity so dramatically that the material signature thinned. Each hypothesis has consequences for how we understand social resilience and vulnerability. If disease was the prime mover, then biogeographical exchange and pathogen dynamics, subjects now accessible through ancient DNA and dental calculus, become central to the story. If climatic catastrophe was the driver, then the focus shifts to landscape engineering and risk management. If violence explains the pause, we begin to reconstruct political economies and the logic of power. Mythic voices often respond to such ruptures by telling stories of divine anger, of taboo violated, or of ancestral curses. These narratives are not just superstition but social attempts to explain sudden suffering and to prescribe pathways back to order. Picture an elder by a cold hearth telling a child why the plaza lies empty. The story becomes both explanation and moral instruction, guiding future behavior. The core question that remains is not whether upheaval happened, it did, repeatedly, but which mix of causes best explains each event. We still don't know, and that uncertainty presses us to integrate paleopathology, paleoecology, and oral tradition into a single, careful conversation. There is also evidence of social networks that ran like invisible rivers across the land, kinship ties that mapped into marriage alliances, craft networks that delivered raw copper from lakes far to the north or shell from the Gulf, and knowledge systems that carried calendrical know-how and ritual protocols across hundreds of kilometers. At certain mound centers we find assemblages containing objects whose raw materials come from dozens or hundreds of miles away. Trade is the obvious explanation, but trade as a single word is too neat. The exchange of goods was wrapped in kinship, ritual reciprocity, political brokerage, and sometimes coercion. We must ask, were these objects moving through gift economies that entwined obligation and alliance, or through merchant circuits that resembled economic specialization more than reciprocity? Evidence from distribution patterns, settlement hierarchies, and the contexts in which exotic goods appear, often in burial or ceremonial caches, suggests that gift exchange and ritual redistribution played heavy roles. Exotic goods frequently show up in contexts that enhance social memory: caches placed in mound foundations, offerings in burials, symbolic deposits under plazas. But competing models argue that entrepreneurs might have existed too, craft specialists who produced and transported goods as a means of establishing patronage networks. Myths about travelers who could speak many languages, of traders who became kings, and of cursed riches that seduced communities into ruin swirl around these objects, and they remind us that material exchange always travels on social rails. Picture a caravan of canoes at dawn, paddles catching like metronomes, goods wrapped in bark and presented as gifts to a leader whose favor secures access to hunting grounds. Now picture a rival leader intercepting such a convoy and demanding tribute. The archaeological record sometimes provides hints of both scenes. We still don't know the exact proportions of gift, brokerage, and exchange for profit at work across different regions and eras, and that uncertainty invites both careful sampling and narrative restraint. There are also governance questions embedded in earthworks. How were decisions about labor mobilization made? Who organized mound construction, and what social mechanisms ensured seasonal turnouts of hands? In some places, the sheer volume of earth moved implies long-term, organized labor, thousands of person-days across decades, and scholars have used experimental archaeology to approximate required workforce sizes. Those estimates, however, are just blunt tools. Social life rarely adheres to the assumptions of controlled experiments. Oral tradition sometimes suggests rotating obligations lodged in kin groups or age-grade systems that called men and women to public labor at certain seasons. Other ethnographers have described labor as a seasonal exchange, paired with ritual reciprocity and feasts that made the work socially rewarding. A competing perspective highlights emergent leadership, charismatic individuals who could craft reciprocal networks and direct labor while maintaining legitimacy through ritual performance. Both models can be true in different contexts, and both rely on subtler mechanisms, debt, prestige, marriage ties, that are often invisible in the archaeological record. Imagine standing in a trench watching volunteer teams replicate basket loading techniques and hearing the archaeologists say, with a smile, "You can do a day's worth of earthwork in a few hours, but it won't capture the feasting, the gossip, the negotiation." The reflective point is that labor is embedded in social life. Building mounds was not merely construction, it was performance, negotiation, and a way of making social bonds tangible. We still don't know the full repertoire of social institutions that underwrote monumental labor across different communities, whether it was kin-based obligation, ritual imperative, or coercive power, and that remains one of archaeology's most pressing questions. And then there are those moments when local memory and scientific insight step into a room together and begin a careful dance. Community elders sometimes possess place names, stories of ceremonies, and clan histories that map perfectly onto archaeological loci, providing cultural context for features that might otherwise be read only in soil. Involving descendant communities in excavation design and interpretation not only enriches scientific models but also restores human dignity to places long treated like puzzle boxes. This cooperative method has transformed several projects, yielding reinterpretations that align material evidence with living memory. Certain rituals that modern archaeology once labeled unknown function are revealed to be versions of still practiced rites, or at least totems whose echoes survive. But collaboration also complicates things. Descendant communities raise ethical claims about remains, about sacred spaces, and about narratives that should not be reduced to sterile data. In that friction, fruitful questions emerge. How should archaeologists balance scientific curiosity with cultural respect? How do we write histories that include the voices of those whose ancestors built the very mounds we study? Mythic threads, of guardian spirits, ancestral mandates, and the right of land to be honored, provide not just color but moral architecture for such decisions. Picture elders and archaeologists standing together at a dig, comparing notes. One points to a motif and says, "That is the place for renewal," while the other explains stratigraphy. The conversation becomes a new kind of excavation, one of memory, ethics, and shared knowledge. We still don't know how such collaborative models will reshape the next century of research, but the early results are promising and humane. If you step back now and look at the threads we have followed, mounds that rise like mute cathedrals, ringed circles that suggest communal choreography, sunken villages that preserve the scent of fish and smoke, causeways that could be trade veins or pilgrimage routes, graves that refuse tidy classification, stones that hold curses or calendars, voyagers who move like weather across rivers. What you see is neither a tidy mosaic nor a collapsed ruin, but a living, complicated skein of human choices. These sights and stories do not add up to a single, unified story because human lives rarely do. Instead, they sketch a set of overlapping modes of being in the world, people who built with earth and wood and social imagination, who negotiated the river's moods, who traveled long distances to exchange goods and ideas, who fashioned myths out of memory and material, who sometimes suffered abrupt change and sometimes adapted with inventive resilience. That complexity can feel unsatisfying if you are looking for a single answer, but it is also the richest kind of history, the kind that teaches us to hold multiple truths at once. We can be confident about certain things, that Mississippi's ancient inhabitants engineered landscapes in ways that required sustained cooperation, that they participated in networks of exchange that stretched beyond what earlier models allowed, that rituals and rites were not peripheral but central to how people organized labor, encoded memory, and made claims on land. And yet we must also accept the wide open spaces where our data runs thin and our interpretations must be tentative. There is humility in that uncertainty, and a kind of moral urgency too, to respect descendant communities, to integrate oral histories with lab-based science, and to recognize that artifacts are not mere curiosities but the remains of lives that deserve dignity. Think for a moment about what it means to build a mound, to shape a causeway, to mark a stone. These are acts that create future audiences. They are conversations with the people who will come after. The labor that created the earthworks was also the labor that tied people to one another, kinship obligations, seasonal festivals, ritual reciprocity, and the very practical necessity of organizing water, food, and shelter. In that sense, monuments are both infrastructure and story. They channel social memory and they embody moral claims. This is our place. This is our law. This is where our ancestors taught us to plant and to mourn. When we excavate, when we measure, When we take core samples and analyze pollen grains, we are not only gathering data, we are listening to those conversations across centuries and attempting to translate them with the best tools we have. Sometimes the translation yields clear results: trade beads that prove far-flung connections, isotopic signals that map childhood geographies, radiocarbon sequences that show bursts of construction or sudden pauses. Sometimes it returns only suggestion, an odd alignment on LiDAR, a magnetometer spike that resists excavation, a handful of exotic sherds that imply contact without simple cause. Both outcomes are valuable. The former grounds our narratives, the latter keeps us honest. We must also reckon with the ways that myth and materiality cohabit these landscapes. People of the present sometimes flatten myths into just stories. But that is a mistake. Myths encode cognitive maps. They carry legal memory. They compress genealogies into emblematic forms, and they are often precise about places and the obligations attached to them. When a community tells of giants, of stones that hum, of curative springs, or of boundary stones that no plow must cross, those accounts are not idle. They are social technologies that shepherd behavior and protect things that matter. Likewise, scientific findings can help illuminate why a myth persisted. A legend of a giant might arise around an unusually tall individual whose social prominence created ritual emphasis, or from a misinterpreted large bone. A cursed stone might be aligned with a site of repeated misfortune simply because that location sits on a floodplain prone to ruin. Neither explanation eliminates the other. Instead, together they produce a fuller picture where myth and science are different vocabularies describing overlapping realities. We should welcome both vocabularies into the conversation and resist the temptation to rank them strictly one over the other. There is a powerful ethical dimension to this work that cannot be overstated. Many of these places remain near living communities who understand their landscapes in ways that modern studies can only approximate. Descendant voices offer not only corroboration but moral frameworks. They ask that burials be treated with ceremony, that ritual spaces be honored, that research be collaborative rather than extractive. The best archaeological practice now is not the solitary trench but the shared table, elders and scientists, youth and surveyors, integrating knowledge systems so that the work becomes reparative as well as inquisitive. Such partnerships have already reshaped interpretations in promising ways. Stories once considered peripheral are now central keys to understanding ritual sequences. Place names transmitted orally have guided the location of features that remote sensing would have missed. Community stewardship has protected sites from development and erosion. At the same time, collaboration complicates careers and funding models. It asks institutions to slow down, to build trust, and to imagine archaeology as civic engagement. This is hard and necessary work, because the stakes are not merely academic. They are about the right to remember, the politics of land, and the dignity of those whose ancestors shaped these places. Then there is the river itself, relentless teacher that it is. Rivers do not care for our tidy chronologies. They rewrite landscapes, burying settlements in silt and exposing buried floors after a flash flood. They create the ecological circumstances that made some sites possible and made others untenable. When we study people who lived in floodplain systems, we must think in terms of cycles and thresholds, years of plenty alternate with years of scarcity. Technologies and rituals evolved to buffer against extremes. Social institutions, kin networks, trade partnerships, ritual obligations, emerge in part to manage risk. The archaeological record preserves traces of both ingenuity and failure, evidence of raised platforms and careful drainage next to strata indicating abandonment. Taken together, these traces tell a story of adaptation and its limits. Some communities changed their practices and persisted. Others relocated, merged, or disappeared as discrete social units only to reappear in altered forms elsewhere. That ebb and flow is not tragedy alone. It is a human story of resilience, sorrow, reinvention, and sometimes renewal. What, then, do we take away from these mysteries? First, that complexity is the rule. Simple, non-causal accounts will not hold. Second, that science and story are complementary tools. One measures, the other interprets motive and meaning. Third, that the past is alive not only in texts and data but in living communities whose memories continue to shape the land. Fourth, that the unanswered questions are not failures but invitations to probe further with better methods, to listen more carefully to oral testimony, to design research that centers reciprocity and ethical stewardship. The future of this inquiry demands technological humility, recognizing instrument limits, methodological pluralism, combining isotopes, ADNA, LiDAR, ethnography, and a moral compass that honors people over papers. And for you, the listener, there is an intimate role. You are the future audience whom mound builders built for in a kind of ethical wager. They shaped places so that you might one day stand there and be moved. Your act of attention matters. Visiting these sites, responsibly, with permission and respect, supporting community-based heritage initiatives, participating in public archaeology programs, or simply learning and sharing accurate stories, all of these are small but meaningful ways to continue the conversation. This is a history that resists completion because it was never meant to be finished. It was meant to be renewed, rehearsed, and inhabited by successive generations. When you tell the story, do so with care, avoid the cheap enchantment of sensational claims. Prefer instead the patient astonishment that comes from attending to detail and acknowledging limits. So keep digging, in the literal sense, with careful trowels and community consent, and keep digging metaphorically, by asking better questions, by refusing easy explanations, and by embracing complexity. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, but many more are lodged in minds and mouths and maps that we have yet to fully consult. The long arc of human life in Mississippi is a story of placemaking, mobility, ritual, sorrow, and creativity. It is not merely the province of archaeologists or elders alone. It belongs to all of us who care about how the past shapes the present, and how the present honors the past's dignity. When you stand on a mound at dusk, when the river breathes and the wind moves through oaks, feel the weight and the lightness of what has been left behind, the evidence that people loved, feared, planned, and failed, and through that messy human energy, made meaning. The more we study, the more we learn that mystery is not a hole to be filled with certainty, but a space to be held with reverence, curiosity, and humility. Now, as we close this particular telling, remember that endings in archaeology are provisional. Each final publication is only the latest verse in a very long conversation begun by countless hands. We offer this script as one thread in that conversation, stitched from field notes and folklore, from charcoal dates and cautions, from wonder and restraint. May it encourage you to look at familiar landscapes with fresh eyes, to value the voices who guard them, and to invest in the patient work of listening. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.